Welcome back to the FS Podcast. And today, Christian, Stephen, and I were able to talk to Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who's a professor at the University of Toronto. He's one of the leading researchers when it comes to frontline journalists that have been affected by covering war or natural disasters. He's done everything from the documentary Journalists Under Fire, and he has a book called Shooting War. He's done lots and lots of material and research when it comes to war journalists who's exposed themselves to this kind of work, such as Christian and I. So it was great to interview him and have a conversation. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining our podcast. I've known about your work for some time, especially the documentary that you helped, Journalists Under Fire. And I'm sure many of the journalists that you have interviewed played a big role into Christian and I's lives of wanting to cover conflict and war. And so I think just to start off, it would be great just to give a little bit, if you can give a little bit about your background, your past work, and maybe what you're currently doing right now.
All right, so thank you for the invitation to be with you. So I'm in Toronto. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I run a research lab as well, so I'm what's called a clinician researcher. I have a clinical practice that I do for 2 days a week, and I do research for the rest of my time. Although I have a long-standing passionate interest in journalism and conflict, my lab really focuses on a completely different area, which is multiple sclerosis. So I'm an MS researcher. But for 20 plus years, I've also had a sideline, as it were, looking at journalists who cover war, how they're affected emotionally by their work, what motivates them to do it, and how I can help them with these challenges. My interest in the topic is long-standing. You can hear from my accent that I'm not Canadian. I'm South African by birth. I grew up in South Africa. Being a white male, I had to do military service while I was there, and I was conscripted. I was a physician at the time. I got sent to a war in northern Namibia, Angola, where I worked as a medical officer.
Wow.
And I saw firsthand what war does to people and how it can destroy societies. And I left South Africa during the apartheid years to go and live in England, where I did my psychiatry training. And then from there, basically got headhunted to Toronto, where I have a faculty position at the university. So that's a quick summary of who I am in terms of my background. So my interest in journalism, I think, to a degree, can be traced to what I saw as a young man working as a medical officer in a combat zone. And I saw the profound degree to which human behavior can change for the worst and for the best in zones of conflict. I never really devoted much time to trauma research until 20 years back. A patient was referred to my clinic who turned out to be a war journalist. And she had a very interesting presentation, and she did very well with therapy. And she was a fascinating woman by nature of the work that she had done. And she explained to me that although she was part of a very large news organization, she couldn't reach out for help when she started to become emotionally unwell, because she was concerned that this would be the end of her career, that she would no longer get sent back to do the kind of work that she loved. And I was intrigued by this, what struck me as a slightly punitive way of dealing with people. And so I asked my MS research team to take the afternoon off and to go away and look and see what was published on this topic of journalism and war and emotional trauma. And they came back and told me that there wasn't a single publication. Wow. And the year was 1999. There wasn't a single publication. And so intrigued by this, I thought, well, I'm interested in trauma. I'd seen trauma as a young man. I'd like to write a proposal to see whether I can fund the study, get funding for a study looking at frontline journalists and trauma. And so I wrote this grant and sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. I think you probably know them. They're subsequently closed. I think they closed this year or last year.
Yeah.
But forum wrote back and said, hey, this is a great idea, we'll fund your study. And so that launched the first ever study of war, journalism, and trauma. And I found that journalists were very keen to talk to me and share their experiences. And the results of that study were published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and that garnered a lot of attention. Suddenly, news organizations were looking at the study and saying, oh, hold on, we've got staff who have been traumatized by this work. To me, it wasn't a surprise, but to them, it's like a revelation that, yes, you send young people off to war, some are going to become traumatized. And to their credit, they started to change a policy and make therapy available to journalists. So I thought, well, I've done this one study, I'll go back to doing my MS work. And then, as you know, 9/11 happened. And soon after 9/11, I was approached by CNN to say, could you come down to New York and help our journalists? And I did that. And it was really a fascinating journey to see our journalists, initially distressed by their trauma, recovered well with therapy and with the passage of time. And so that was my second foray into journalism. And then, the world being what it is, soon after that, the war in Iraq started in 2003. And I was approached by news organizations to say, well, we know you've done this work, up till now, but can you answer the question of whether being embedded with the military is good for a journalist or not? Is it helpful if we attach our journalists to the combat unit, or should they be independent of soldiers? And so we did a study investigating that. And so bit by bit, my work has evolved according to questions asked of me by news organizations. In the mid-decade, the last decade, I was approached by UNESCO to undertake a study looking at journalists covering the drug trade in Mexico. Very, very dangerous work. And so I did a study showing how this was having a profound effect on journalists doing this work. And subsequent to that, I've done work on journalists working in Syria, in Iran, in Kenya, most recently Afghanistan. We've looked at the concept of user-generated content, these journalists who are sitting in newsrooms all day just screening this tough visual material. Yeah. And more recently, we've done some research looking at moral injury in journalists covering the refugee crisis in Europe. So you can see that over the past 20 years, I've done a number of studies, in large measure dictated by what news organizations are interested in, and also what interests me.
Wow. No, that's great. I know, your work and some of the journalists that you profiled. Are you still in contact with a lot of the older generation of journalists, or do you keep in touch and how they are now doing after they spent some time, taking a break from war, and how they're coping?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. And someone's asked that question before. So I do my research, and then, in some cases, I remain in contact with the journalists. I've remained in contact with many photojournalists. And last year, as part of my Shooting War project, we brought 10 of those journalists to Toronto for a 2-day meeting. And, they are not old, but they're not the new generation of photojournalists. So we're talking about Santiago Lyon and Corinne Dufka and Ron Haviv. We even managed to get Tim Page to come all the way from Australia for this.
Wow.
And so we had this fascinating 2-day meeting of, some of the generation's greatest war photographers all in one, up on the stage, in one stage, talking about their work and their life and how they've been affected. David Guttenfelder was there, Carol Guzzi. It was a wonderful 2-day meeting. So I've retained contact with some journalists like that, but I've researched now over close to 1,000 frontline journalists, and it's not possible to remain.
Yeah. You might go crazy if you talk to all of them. Christian, you had a question?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's interesting to be doing it because obviously with your research being mainly focused on MS and your clinical practice, I find it very, very interesting that you would keep returning to this. I wonder if that's simply by nature of it being something that you discovered was underserved. But I also would I would be interested in whether you're actually also interrogating something that was deeper in you from when you were in Namibia. I wonder if this is sort of a longer interrogation of something within you that is a mystery that you're still unraveling, that you see similarities in.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think it's the latter. Namibia took place 35 years ago, but no doubt it had a very profound formative influence on me, because it cemented my love of psychiatry to begin with. I was not convinced I was going to do psychiatry as a career, but I saw so many remarkable behavioral changes in people in war zones that I became fascinated by behavior. And while I certainly did not want to do my military service, I was really opposed to apartheid. And we're very clear, I'd like to go on record and say that. And I never carried a gun. I carried a medical bag. But paradoxically, this period in my life that I didn't want to be part of ended up having this profound influence on my career, because it got me interested in psychiatry and human behavior. And I've not lost that interest. And you will know this. You have been to war zones yourself. You see how war brings out the best and the worst in people. And I wrote about this. I actually published my when I was up in Namibia and working as a medical officer, I was with a very small group of men in a very isolated area. I observed their behavior, and I wrote a paper on what it was like to be in the front lines of conflict as a psychiatric medical officer observing people, and I published that in the American Journal of Psychiatry. So even back then, I had this desire to do research and was fascinated by the way people's behavior changed in extreme situations. And I think in part that can explain my enduring interest in this topic. But I think what's taken over in a much more deeper way is I just find journalists very interesting. Number one, you're very creative. You write beautifully, or you take, fantastic photographs. You're a creative group of individuals. And then, ally that to the group that I've studied have voluntarily put themselves in the front lines of war for 20 years or more. There's no other profession that does this. Not even soldiers have this longevity of exposure to war. I mean, soldiers have a tour of duty, maybe 2, maybe 3, and then it stops. Mm-hmm. But the group that I've studied have gone back repeatedly to conflict, whether it was the Balkans, then Afghanistan, then Syria, then, wherever it is, they keep on going back to conflict. And so their cumulative exposure to danger is unrivaled by any profession. And as someone who's intrigued by human behavior, that interests me. Why are you doing it? What's motivating you to do this? Wow. And of course, what are the consequences of that? So that's what the last 20 years of this research has been devoted to. As my work evolves, more questions surface that need answering. And, I'm now moving very much into moral injury, which is something that has hardly been looked at in journalists. But the military know about this, have known about it for decades.
That's interesting. Going to I want to follow up on the moral injury question, but I love how you said it's, it brings up more questions. We've constantly, I think, over the last few years, as we've gotten a little older and married and, other developments, we have that constant questioning of why are we doing this? And we've settled down in our travels quite a bit, but the obvious answer we would have consistently when we were younger, well, of course we're going here. Of course we're going to go there. We didn't stop to sort of ask why. But the consistent re-traumatizing that we would willingly sort of bring upon ourselves by going to these places, it's only as I get a little older that I start to, look deeply at what that is, what that thing within myself or within Dylan or within the rest of the journalists who do what we do, what that thing in us is crying out for, or what that desire is to fill. Because I know for soldiers, you have the shared burden with your platoon, with your battalion,
brotherhood.
You basically get to spread the trauma over a group, and you're doing it for each other. I know that war is one of the only times that, I don't mean to specify gender here, but I will for this case. War is the only time that men can really show unconditional love for each other without it seeming odd. And I know it's interesting in the way of, for journalists, we don't have that camaraderie as much, because if a lot of journalists, they're quite suspicious of each other. And so to sort of have the trauma and then also the isolation of, you get your story over here and don't help the others over here. I think there's a definite poison to that. It's extremely unhealthy in a way that when you're a soldier, you're able to share a moral not superiority, but health in some ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does to a degree. Although I have to say that my exposure to many frontline journalists, and I mean, I've actually found there's quite a strong bond between them. The same thing you've spoken about, the way soldiers have this kind of bond that comes with combat. I mean, I've certainly seen that the journalists who, for example, covered the Balkans and lived through this for many years, they've formed very strong bonds. And it was striking that when we had this shooting war event in Toronto last year, and we brought these journalists to Toronto, this was a group that had worked together intensely, say in the Balkans, and then they'd gone their own separate ways. I mean, I could see that they were very close to one another. There's this kind of bonds that soldiers had formed had taken root in these journalists as well, which I found really quite touching, and I think was in many ways protective for them. That allowed them to get through some really difficult experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But where I think you're correct is that whereas the military has often provided very strong institutional support to soldiers, news organizations have not done it to their journalists. And so, they've gone through these very intense, difficult experiences over many years, and they haven't had the resources at times to help them deal with what they were feeling emotionally.
Yeah.
And that's been a challenge.
I think that definitely gets to more of the point that I was going for. I don't think I communicated it as well as I could have. Obviously, Dylan and I and our fixers and some of the journalists that were on the ground in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, we love those people. We still talk to them.
Yeah.
We have those shared burdens. I think it is much more to what you were saying towards the end of it, which is the news organizations, the pressure to achieve, the pressure to sort of beat the other organization to getting this thing.
Yeah.
I think that's more of it. So you've got sort of the almighty corporation that is eyeing you as something dispensable instead of something that is essential. But that's fascinating. Dylan, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I would say most of my experience, I probably should have done a better job of being connected with the journalist community when I was overseas. I spent so much of my time with the locals. I would live with the local people. I would live with local military people. I would really put my time with the local people. And I knew there were houses that had 20 journalists in there, and they had and I would go over and hang out with them. We would go to, a bar after going to the front lines and re-link up. But I really spent most of my time with local journalists or local fixers, and have tea, spend time with their family. But one of the questions I was wondering is, people in Iraq, it seemed like the local people, whether journalists or fixers, coped with seeing awful things or stress much better than I did, especially when I would go back home and have a really hard time. I know a lot of people in Iraq, especially I'm 31, so there's people my age who spent their entire life, going through this. And it almost seems like they're kind of like a surgeon where they're so used to it. And so I was just wondering if you spent any time talking to local journalists who live in Iraq or Afghanistan, if they have the same kind of issues as foreign correspondents who go there and come back.
Yeah. We have, yes, very much so. And I don't think that the news is good. I mean, my first exposure to that was Mexico.
Oh yeah.
I went back to Mexico City 6 times to get this UNESCO study started, and in the end, we got some really strong data. And what we showed was that the local Mexican journalists covering the drug cartels are getting hammered, and they can't escape. That's the difference. The Western journalists can fly in and fly out, but the Mexican journalists can't escape. And so they're kind of living in it. And as you know, the bad guys, the drug cartels, and even the government at times, corrupt police, corrupt local officials, target the journalist. And they don't just target the journalist, they target their family. Yeah, and that we have really strong data to show that the moment the families are being targeted, the distress levels in the journalists ratchet upwards. And and so that was a horrendously difficult experience, obviously, for the journalists to go through. Plus, Mexican news organizations were not doing anything to help their journalists. They were just kind of ignoring this problem. They were giving them, arguably the world's most dangerous job at one point to do. And the journalists were being, kidnapped. They were getting killed. Their families were getting targeted. And there was no support for them. And that was striking. So, UNESCO published that and highlighted the plight of Mexican journalists. Interestingly enough, last week I was on a program with Mexican journalists in which, we went back through looking at my studies and data. Nothing's changed. And here we are, almost 10 years on from that Mexican study, and still Mexican journalists are being hammered in this fashion. And then the most recent study that we've done to follow up on your point was that we've looked at journalists in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, if anything, it's even more difficult because, within Mexico, there is a culture of talking about mental health. You can go and see a psychiatrist. I've been the guest of my academic colleagues in Mexico, where there's some really excellent psychiatric expertise in Mexico. But in Afghanistan, you don't have that. And so you've got this country that's, on the brink, in which journalists are being targeted by the Taliban and also at times by the government, in which life is so dangerous for journalists. And there is no psychological expertise, or very little, there's very little psychological expertise in the country. I mean, the World Health Organization published a report a couple of years back saying that, psychiatric services in Afghanistan were sketchy, and the quality of the service was poor. And so, we published this paper this year showing that Afghan journalists have very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're just not getting the help for it. And so, and they can't escape it. This is their society. They can't leave. So I think, in many ways, the plight of the local journalist who's doing this work, who's being asked to cover such dangerous work, their plight is even harder than the Western journalist. I think it's
Yeah, and they're watching them taking foreigners to specific areas and have to watch over them, that whole stress level. So I always try to talk about the local fixers or local people, just because if you're a journalist going into a war zone, it's almost 99% is who your local partners is, in a lot of ways, especially in conflict zones.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And I think this firsthand, but these journalists are having a really bad time dealing with the trauma that they have to do. And there doesn't seem to be any way out of it for them because they can't leave the country. The country is perpetually in conflict. It's exhausting. The conflict never stops. They're concerned about the welfare of their family, which I say ratchets up their level of anxiety. And then in the case of a country like Afghanistan, you just don't have adequate, good psychiatric care to address this problem.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think especially one thing I've noticed that we've heard a lot from our local fixers and also local journalists on the ground is in the last 4 years, as the news cycle has turned inward and more, to domestic issues and the rise of nationalism in a lot of different Western nations, the endless wars continue. And yet, a lot of what the local journalists went through seemed bearable when the eyes of the world was on it. It was like, well, I'm going through this so people will see what my output is. People will see what's going on. But now when it's, U.S. domestic news and domestic news and a lot of countries having a internal crisis, the local journalists are basically flung out there saying, well, I'm still doing this job that I'm being traumatized daily doing. And yet no one is reading, no one is watching. And as the revenue goes down in the new business models of media and journalism, and it's much more Facebook and social media, it becomes a case of, is there any long-term way forward for what journalism was and what it used to be? Because at this point, we have this feedback loop of seeing everything all the time, constantly. And for journalists, I worry what the future will be for that. Do you have any thoughts on what could be the next stage of what journalism will look like? Do you think it will be worse in the ways of what you're studying, or do you see some hope there?
You know, I'm cautious in answering a question like this because I'm not a journalist and I don't study the media. I study mental health. Yeah. But, you know, there's good hard data to show that in societies that are perpetually in conflict, the consequences on mental health are stark and severe. That emerged very clearly during the prolonged civil wars in the Balkans. So society pays a tremendous price for this kind of conflict. And I've no doubt that in places like Afghanistan right now, where there is just ongoing severe trauma in which, you know, as a journalist said to me, you know, the Afghan journalist said to me, we never know when we wake up in the morning whether we're going to survive the day or not. You know, so imagine going to work with this, and if this is, you know, if this is your standard way of working, it's very, very unhealthy, and you need to see that against the backdrop of a society that's getting hammered as well, with suicide bombings and you know, schools getting targeted and weddings, and you know, so the level of violence is so high that, you know, I can say with a great degree of certainty that this is going to leave, and has left, the Afghan population. Just Afghanistan is one example. It's left this country with a very significant mental health problem.
Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, how are they going to address that? That's the big challenge. It's very hard to address it when trauma is still taking place on a daily basis. You know, it's hard to go in and say, okay, we're going to give you therapy today, when tomorrow, you know, your friends are going to get blown up and just re-traumatized. And so, you know, that's one of the challenges. But, you know, I am optimistic, and there are ways to do this. And I learned this from, you know, my contact with anthropologists. And I'll give you an example. You know, Mozambique went through a prolonged civil war, a very brutal civil war decades back. It destroyed the country. Yeah. It reduced it to a point where at one stage, Mozambique was the world's poorest country. And so at the end of that, you know, when communities had been decimated by civil war, we're talking about civil war over here, and communities that turned on one another, neighbors that turned on one another. How are you going to fix that? You know, Western psychiatry can't go in and deal with that. The United Nations are not going to go in and deal with that. So what people had to do was develop their own homegrown model. How do we heal ourselves? How can we come to terms with which is what has happened to us, and how can we move on from that? And they came up with a model that allowed them to do it. People are creative. They realized that if we're going to be stuck perpetually in a cycle of revenge and retribution, and we're going to live in the past and not let bygones be bygones, we will never move on. We will continue to destroy one another and essentially consume ourselves. And so that's very, very painful. You can imagine what this is like. But they essentially welcomed, you know, villages and aspects of their society, welcomed back into the midst the kind of people who had been perpetrating violence on them. There was like acceptance and a forgiveness, and to say, okay, come back and talk about what's happened, and you can discuss what is done and make your, you know, absolutions and regrets, but we're going to move on. We're not going to remain trapped by this violence. And I think, you know, that takes an extraordinary courage and forgiveness and an extraordinary mental construct to do it. But they did it to a degree, which allowed them to move on. And one can hope that in a place like Afghanistan, and I keep on coming back to it because this is it's so fresh in my mind. We've just finished a study on our Afghan journalists. My hope is that an Afghan society will be able to do a similar thing, that people can move on from the horrors of what they've had to endure for the past 40 years. Because if they can't, then essentially society will dismantle and crumble and fall apart.
That's right. And I think it's fascinating extrapolating sort of a single person being traumatized to, you know, a nation being traumatized. I mean, on the subject of healing, I don't want this to be too harsh of a segue, but, you know, it's interesting in the way of for PTSD in journalists and also in members of the military. We've been looking into some aspects of virtual reality in the way of the 360 immersive side. And so I was wondering if, get to that in a second, does the brain, this gets more to your research, I think, does the brain change like physiologically when exposed to trauma? Like, of course, I know there's, the emotional side effects, but the physiology of the brain, are there changes that are irrevocable when that happens?
Well, it certainly changes, because whatever you feel emotionally has been generated by the brain. Whatever you feel physically has been generated by brain function. So absolutely, the brain changes. The brain changes, we divide our brain changes into structural. Does the anatomy, the coarse anatomy of the brain change? And the function, does the function of the brain change? And the answer is does. And one of the big problems with prolonged trauma that's not addressed, where you can't move on from it, is that you are living in a constant state of stress. Yeah. And your body putting out, stress hormones like cortisol. And high levels of cortisol are not good for the brain. And high levels of cortisol can lead to areas of brain atrophy or shrinkage of the brain that can have, permanent effects. And so there is no doubt that prolonged emotional trauma will affect the brain structurally and functionally, which is one of the reasons why therapy is so important, and therapy given early on, because the longer you wait, in medicine in general, the longer you wait, the worse the outcome. So you want to be able to intervene early to reduce this level of distress, bring down stress, and help a person deal emotionally and return their emotions to some kind of healthy baseline. Because if you don't do it, there are going to be consequences, long-term consequences on brain structure and function.
Yeah, that's pretty close to me, because I'm 31, so I've been doing this since I was like 20, and I went into one therapist, but never didn't have experienced anything in the field wise, like as far as conflict, but he was certified to be a psychiatrist for PTSD.
Right.
I spent 1 hour and left, and then never went back. And so I am lucky to where I'll be married for 6 years next month, which is pretty rare. And I would say my therapist has always been my wife, and because she's been really incredible, and I got really lucky with that. And so there are some things that I'm still working on. And feel free to ask us questions too.
I think, I should have made this point early on, and I think it's a really important point. And I'll say it over and over again. The majority of journalists who do this kind of work do not have PTSD. They do not have depression. This is not a profession that is riddled with PTSD and depression. It's not.
That's good to know.
And so, many, many people go off and do this work for a long time and don't develop the things that I'm talking about. So it's a minority that succumb to this. But the minority is not a small one. It's, the journalists who do this kind of frontline work are much more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder than a journalist who stays home in a safe society and who reports on arts or diet or nutrition or whatever. So that's the first point. The other point is that, and you raise it, good relationships are protective to mental health across the board. And so if you've got good marriage or a good relationship with your partner, good friendships, these things are protective in terms of one's mental well-being, not just for something like post-traumatic stress disorder.
For general.
Even for major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, for example, the most severe of all mental illnesses. If you were able to establish good relationships before the onset of your illness, and you've been able to maintain that, it becomes a powerful protective factor in terms of your mental well-being. And this is one of the things that I try and put across in my work with frontline journalists, is to let them know that, good relationships are good for you. They are protective in terms of your mental well-being. Yes, you're going to live your life passionately, you're going to put all your energies into your work, but also devote energy and time to your relationships, because it just makes you a stronger person emotionally.
Yeah. Totally. It's fascinating. I mean, on a larger point, just for the general life, that advice, absolutely. But I think it's fascinating. It brings up something that I think Dylan and I, when traveling together, we always had each other, stayed in the same hotel rooms. We were all at the same places. We saw the same things. And I know I speak for myself, when none of those experiences we experienced together affected me in a way that would be described as, extremely traumatically. The only time that I've had an experience that, I was diagnosed with PTSD for this experience was when he and I were on a trip. Oh, I was on a trip without him. which is when I was tortured coming out of Syria. And so it was really a case of, it's fascinating you mentioned that, because the one time I was separated from my safe partner during this work is the one time that it took root in the mind. So that's interesting to mention. I know for Dylan as well, when you took one trip without me to Iraq, and when you had your experience.
Yeah, for me, I've never had anything physically happen to me, even though we've had close calls, sniper fire, mortar rounds hitting the top of our car, but it was like a dud, so it just bounced off. But for me, it's always been like countless imagery of kids, and the most awful thing you could see to kids, especially I covered almost the entire Mosul operation, which I think after down the road, I think it was one of the largest urban warfares since maybe World War II, something like that. It felt like very close to like what you would see in Saving Private Ryan, in a close, like when they were inside the city. So yeah, I would say Christian and I, when we were separated and did different projects on our own, there was definitely an uptick of not knowing, coping with different problems. So,
yeah, good points. Yeah.
And so that kind of we've been doing virtual reality and filming 360 since 2015. And so I was wondering if seeing imagery of that kind of stuff, is there any benefits as far as the research part, or is that just going to harm? Because we have been working on some VR films that they show, like if people want to see what Frontline and what trauma is like, such as kids being hurt, as kids screaming, having a PTSD attack in the middle of an interview, and then seeing journalists like witnessing that stuff. So if someone wanted to see like, okay, here is what a war journalist goes through a immersive experience, which might be a little bit too intense, is that just going to cause more problem, or is there any kind of research that I know this is something, it's new and it's not, right, there's no clinical trials, or there might be, so just your opinion on it.
Well, one of the when you look at the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, you divide them into different categories. And the first category is re-experiencing the trauma. So that can be unwanted recollections or memories of it, sights or sounds or smells. You don't want it. It just intrudes unconsciously into your recollection. Maybe flashbacks or nightmares. So that's the re-experiencing. The second group of symptoms refers to avoidance, in which you make a conscious effort to avoid recollections of it. It's just too painful. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to have a flashback. You don't want to smell those smells. So you do whatever you can to try and avoid that, by distracting yourself, by doing something different, by staying away from reminders of it. And there are two other broad symptom groupings. One is your autonomic nervous system becomes over-aroused, so you become irritable, you can't concentrate, you can't fall asleep, you have a startle response, you're hypervigilant. And the fourth symptom grouping refers to this almost like a depressive feeling. You start anticipating negative events, and you think of the future, more negative things are going to happen to you, and things that you could enjoy in the past, you can't enjoy anymore. So, when you go into this immersive experience that you describe, what you're doing is that you are really pushing back against the avoidance. You are really bringing the trauma in a very real way back to the person. Now, if a person's got full-blown PTSD, you would have to be careful of that, of course. But if that's going to be practiced together with therapy, in other words,
correct, yeah,
we'll have we'll try and overcome your avoidance by exposure. And then as part of exposure, you're going to get therapy with a skilled psychologist or psychiatrist. Potentially that might be helpful, because one of the challenges of therapy is that you want to overcome this avoidance. You need to get rid of the avoidant behavior, because the avoidance can be so destructive. And so I'm aware of a literature that proposes using, as you said, virtual reality as a way of recreating a traumatic event, exposing a person to it without the risk of the person getting killed, of course, but then using that as a conduit to therapy and helping them with their emotions that arise from this. Because remember this, the person who's traumatized retains a physiological imprint of their trauma. This is a very deep protective mechanism that we have as a species. When something bad happens to us, our body remembers it. We might not be consciously aware of it, but our body retains an imprint of it through a process of conditioning. For example, when we go up to a hot stove, we don't put our hand on the stove because we know it's going to give us pain. And when our hand gets close to the stove, we pull it away because we don't want to get burnt. We don't think about all of that. It's done instinctively, right? We don't say to ourselves, oh, yes, this is going to burn me. I better pull my hand away. You do it and you instinctively pull your hand away. We've learned that through conditioning, through priming. We know that this is this deeply built defense mechanism that says, don't go there because you're going to get hurt. We don't have to consciously think of it. It just happens. And it's the same with trauma. That we can have a conscious memory of what happened. We can remember the mortar that landed on the roof of your car, but there are going to be other things that you might not remember. But your body retains a physiological imprint of that, which is not something that you're not consciously aware of. And so, with that understanding, when you put a person into a traumatic experience through virtual reality, the body is going to awaken. Those memories, those deeply embedded physiological memories are still there and will respond potentially to what you're doing, which could explain why people become so distressed by these recollections that you could put someone into a Private Ryan type movie and hey, it's scary, but the movie finishes and you're going to have a meal. But put a traumatized person, immerse them into the intensity of that, and you will get a fundamentally different response.
Right.
Because their body is reacting physiologically differently to what they are experiencing. And you should look at the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist in Boston, who has written about the physiological imprint of trauma, that your body retains this physical memory of trauma.
It's fascinating. I know when we were doing, some film festival routes and they would show sort of like a little clip of things that we had covered, there were a few times I would be doing the Q&A and they would show it above for the audience to see before opening up the panel. And a few times it would get to a point where I would just have a full-blown, panic attack just with the certain sound of specific rounds that we used at gunfire and all of this. And then obviously, you get to a point where you start to investigate it and try and recover a little bit. But I think one of the interesting things, even just mentioning the negative experience a few questions back, my central nervous system went into a tightening because, as you say, the physiology is there. I think one of the things that I've been interested in, I would love to know your opinion on this, is the use of psilocybin in therapy. I know that MDMA is extremely well studied for PTSD, but what about the other substances? Do you have any thoughts on that?
One thing, and I haven't done this work, and I am familiar with the literature. I mean, the principle behind it is this: you want to try and take the sting out of your traumatic recollections.
Right.
So, as I mentioned to you, one of the hallmarks of trauma is that people consciously avoid recollections of what's upsetting them. You don't want to think about this. You don't want to go back to the scene of your trauma. You find your flashbacks very upsetting. In the context of these mind-altering drugs, like you've just mentioned, people can revisit their trauma without feeling that level of emotional distress. That's one of the principles behind it. And so by helping people go back to think about their trauma, not to avoid it, to confront it in a way, but to do it at a time in which, through medication, your body is not going to experience this overwhelming sense of distress, that can be therapeutic. And so by going through this process a number of times, you break down the avoidance. You allow people to confront their past traumas without having this catastrophic emotional reaction. And by doing that sequentially, you can start healing. Now, other ways to do it. There's something called prolonged exposure therapy, in which this is exactly what therapists do, but you don't use medications. But you gently take the person back to the trauma. You expose them again, bit by bit, while helping them relax, by dealing with the emotional consequences of this re-experiencing. And bit by bit, you break it down that way. And this has got the principles behind this have a long history in behavioral medicine. The classic example of this is phobic avoidance. The kid that gets bitten by a dog and then develops a phobia for a dog. And every time he sees the dog, he runs away from the dog. And as an adult, it's still there. So when he sees the dog, he crosses the street to avoid the dog. Well, one way of doing that is through exposure therapy. You bring the individual back with the phobic object, which is the dog. And gradually you expose the person to this phobia. And what happens is that the emotional responses, the distress, starts attenuating. And so the person becomes more comfortable with it. It's the same principles with this overwhelming trauma, that you re-experience, you encourage the person to go back and recollect and think about what they've been avoiding, but you do it in a way that is less distressing, whether it's through prolonged exposure therapy or using mind-altering substances that you've spoken about.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, we have a few more questions because I know you have a busy schedule.
I'm good until 2:00, so we can go. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's what I guess was kind of like the last part I want to talk about. What are some things that journalists who cover war that could get better? Is it therapy, or each person's kind of different? What should we do? yeah, exactly.
You guys look fine to me. So, once again, to repeat, the majority of journalists are not traumatized by it. I mean, you all have memories of terrible things that you've seen, but that doesn't mean you are traumatized by that, right? Mm-hmm. There isn't a frontline journalist I've met who doesn't have this whole repository of terrible memories going back over, 20 years. Like in medicine, as physicians, you remember things in the emergency room, things in the operating room that were awful, but that doesn't necessarily make you traumatized by that. You become traumatized when your memories get in your way of functioning, when you can't pursue your career, or it starts, undercutting your relationships. And the moment your emotional symptoms start doing that, that's when you've got a problem. But a memory by itself is not necessarily a problem.
That's really good. Yeah. Because I do notice that some journalists that will go, they might overhype things. I was like, well, let's break it down and stuff. So, but it is a sensitive subject to talk to people about that kind of stuff. Yeah.
It is. But I mean, my message, which I repeat time and time again, is that the profession's in a better shape when you are educated about this topic. So when you know about trauma and you understand it, you understand how it can manifest, what causes it, how it can be dealt with, how it can be treated, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. By educating journalists in this fashion, journalists become stronger. You become stronger as a person, and you become stronger as a journalist. Because the bottom line is, journalism depends on healthy journalists. And news organizations are the better for having healthy journalists. No one wants to be traumatized. It's the obvious to say that. And so, don't let people suffer unnecessarily.
It's embarrassing to be traumatized as well, which is not something that people really think about. Like, it's embarrassing to have these things sort of, come into your daily life and impede you from doing normal things. It's embarrassing to talk about with a partner. It's embarrassing to sort of admit, you mentioned that Martha Gellhorn, the name of the book was Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave. I thought that was a fascinating point that you sort of drilled down into in the way of this veneer of invincibility, because that's, the mythologizing that we do of this, profession, even the ones of us who have been traumatized within it, is ongoing, and it's interesting in the way of the vulnerability needed to actually heal is most notably absent in this profession, I find.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that was a problem, certainly 20 years back when I started to do it, because it just wasn't a culture of talking about this as well. But I think what you've tapped into is the broader issue of stigma in relation to mental illness. People, it's much easier for someone to say, hey, I broke my leg yesterday, than to say, hey, I broke my psyche,
Right.
and that's the reality that we confront all the time as mental health specialists. But, I'll share some really impressive data with you, encouraging data. we've just finished a study looking at how journalists have been covering the pandemic, the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
It goes without saying that this is the biggest health story that's been around, for such a long time. And we showed that those news organizations who provided therapy to journalists and journalists made use of the therapy, those journalists were in a much better psychological state than the journalists who hadn't received therapy. It's quite striking.
Wow.
And in fact, 53% of our sample had gone to talk to someone in relation to what they were feeling emotionally as part of their work covering the pandemic, which is great because, 20 years back, this wasn't happening. This wasn't happening at all. So 20 years, believe it or not, is not a long time in medical history, but in 20 years, there's now a recognition on the part of good news organizations that this is an important topic and that we should make therapy available to journalists if they need it. And the journalists who make use of it are in a much better state psychologically than those who never got therapy or who refused it when you're dealing with a difficult story like the pandemic. So that's encouraging to me. That's a real positive shift. That's a change.
That's great.
That you guys are going to be aware of. You probably worked as freelancers, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
You don't have access to what I'm just talking about,
Right.
So, the data that I've got in relation to the pandemic comes from journalists working for news organizations who are now looking after their journalists the way they should.
Which is good.
But they're doing it now. The freelancers are still out there and they don't have this.
Yeah.
Well, which leads to, all of the self-medicating that, we're very well acquainted with, there's a lot of us in recovery. There's a lot of us that aren't.
Yeah.
It was fascinating.
Well, I know you probably you have a class coming up, and we could talk to you for multiple times, and we would love to talk with you again down the road. This has been really impactful, and we love the work that you do, and we'll try to do something else down the road, and maybe when we finish our VR film, we can send it to you and see what you think.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to see that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, sir.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Right, bye.